Okay, so here are the 5 most common questions we've been getting about women elders, or really in general, women in leadership in the church. And so I just thought I'd take some time to respond to some of them. There are no women elders in the Bible. Actually, there are no elders that are named in the New Testament. And some of the terminology, the word for overseer, episkopos, and the word for elder, presbyteros, are sometimes used interchangeably. And lots of people say this. John Piper says this. Other church historians have noted this. And several church historians, Robert Louis Wilkin and some others, quote the writings of the early Christian leaders from like the 2nd and 3rd centuries, who kind of note that these words are less like titles and more like functions. Or to put it another way, they're more like verbs than they are nouns. And so they're used kind of loosely and in an airtight way. And it's not until Christianity gets kind of brought into the Roman Empire and it becomes more formal, that actually the more formal the church gets, the more hierarchical the roles get and the more patriarchal they get. So there's something interesting there that makes you ask yourself, is that the cultural corruption that actually occurred in the 4th century? The second one, but Paul is clear. 1 Timothy 2, I do not permit a woman, and we can read this here, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Now, we don't trip on this verse because we don't like it. That's not a good reason to say, let's look again or look more closely. If there's something that you puzzle over, it shouldn't just be because you don't like it or it doesn't gel with our culture. Actually, what makes us trip on these words is that it doesn't seem to gel with the rest of the Bible as a whole. It doesn't seem to gel with Genesis, where women are God's image, and it doesn't seem to gel with Jesus, who gives women the task of proclaiming the resurrection. But even more specifically, it doesn't seem to gel with Paul's own actions and words elsewhere. Euodia and Syntyche, whom Paul names as co-laborers. These are people, he's like, you've got to figure this out because I count on you as co-laborers. Junia, who is named with this, Andronicus, I think her husband, they're well known as apostles, and they were in prison. They didn't go to prison because they were hosting parties. What is it Junia was doing that landed her in prison? Paul gives Phoebe the task of carrying his letter of Romans to the church in Rome, which, again, by tradition, we know this is not like the UPS person. This is the person who's meant to explain and expound on these words. So if you really thought women should remain quiet, he wouldn't have given that job to Phoebe. Priscilla taught Apollos when he was missing some doctrine. So you go, well, wait a minute, she's having authority over a person. And so it does seem like we got to look a little bit closer, and then when we frame it in the context of what's going on in Ephesus, we go, oh, the cult of Artemis had its own creation myth where women were primary and men were ancillary. And so Paul goes, let's remember the Genesis creation story, and he states it in this really, extreme way to kind of say, let's level the ground up a bit. So he's using this, seems to be like a rhetorical device to kind of level it down. And when you listen to this verse in the Common English Bible, it actually, it says a wife should learn with complete submission. So again, that word woman could be translated wife, maybe arguably is better that way. I don't allow a wife to teach or control her husband. Instead, she should be a quiet listener. And that all of a sudden goes, that sort of makes more sense. Okay, number 3. But Glenn, men are the head. They're supposed to be the head. Yeah, I understand that. And the headship passages do show up in the Bible. They show up 3 times. And 2 times it's very clearly about a household, a family. And so it's not man is the head of woman, but husband over wife. And then the other time is in 1 Corinthians 11, which I'll read it to you. It says, I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. So here's what we need to see is the connection here is to the Trinity. And there is no hierarchy in the Trinity. In fact, it's a Trinitarian heresy to say that there's hierarchy within the Trinity. There's no hierarchy. So we don't draw it as Father, then Son, then Holy Spirit as the boss of each other, in these sort of cascading umbrellas or whatever. It's not like that. The Father in Trinitarian theology is meant to be seen as the source. The Son is begotten and the Spirit proceeds. But the Father is the source. So there's this triangle that you could actually lay flat and see it on this plane. So when you read the household stuff, even Ephesians 5, it does say, wives submit to your husbands, but right before that had said, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So you have a triangle that Christ is the top. He's the source. He's the head. And husbands and wives submit to each other out of that. I actually think you can take that to be a link back to the creation story as well. If the Son and the Spirit, the Spirit proceeds from and the Son is begotten from the Father, there's a kind of origin sense of headship. Then even in the creation story, the woman comes from the man. There's an origin story there for the woman. So headship means origin, source. You go, well, what does that actually mean in a marriage? Maybe it means things like protection, provision, providing for you, the source for. And why wouldn't it apply to the church? Well, I think in a similar way to the triangle of the home where Christ is the head and husband and wife submit to each other, I think in a similar way in the church, Christ is the head of the church. And so men and women together submit to one another and lead. And the other thing that's a little bit different is I don't think everything that applies to a household applies to a church. I think there's something here about saying the Spirit gives many gifts, and it's not just one couple or one set of people. It's a whole group, community of people who are gifted by the Spirit to serve and lead. What about the 12 disciples? Didn't Jesus choose all male? That is true. And I do think the 12 disciples were meant to be symbolic of a new Israel. And so the fathers of Israel, the sources of these tribes, represented the nation. And so the disciples were meant to be Jesus saying, I'm constituting a new people of God. But those 12 disciples were not the only disciples. Others were disciples as well, including women. In fact, that really famous story about Mary and Martha saying, oh, come on, Mary's just, tell her to help. She's just sitting down. She's actually doing what disciples do. She's sitting at the feet of her rabbi. So there's something here about, is Martha quibbling with Mary acting like a disciple? And Jesus is the one who says, leave her alone. She's chosen the better part, and it won't be taken from her. You can't take away from her the ability of being one of my disciples. So there's something there. Okay, finally, maybe the question here is, you basically just think men and women are the same? No. I believe so deeply in the Genesis design and order of creation that there's something in Genesis that shows us that men and women are created as paired opposites. In fact, it matches the series of paired opposites in the creation story, from heavens and earth to the waters of the heavens and the waters of the deep, the earth of the land and the seas. And so male and female, they're paired opposites. In fact, it's because men and women are not the same that we need both. And we need both by the gifts of the Spirit to function in their divine and God-given call. It's really important for me to note that there are several Christian traditions, including the Assemblies of God, who were ordaining women before women had the right to vote. So it's not a cultural capitulation, it's a conviction about the gifting and calling of women. And throughout church history, despite the overwhelming structure after Christianity became Romanized or institutionalized, despite so many of the offices being patriarchal, there are these moments of women leading in significant ways, including Macrina, who's the sister of a couple of really influential Eastern theologians. So I hope that helps with some of this. What we're trying to do is reclaim a New Testament or even biblical vision for men and women in Jesus, through the Spirit, in the Spirit, leading together. Hope that helps.